Stop scrolling, not because this is loud, not because this is emotional, but because what you're about to hear may quietly dismantle the way you've been living your life. Most people don't fail because they aren't capable. They fail because they leave too early. They leave relationships too soon. They abandon themselves too fast. They quit the process right before it starts working. And no one tells them that's what's happening. You've been taught to chase motivation, confidence, clarity, but no one taught you what to do when those things disappear. No one taught you how to stay when the excitement fades and the silence begins. This video isn't about success. It's about what comes before success, the part nobody posts, nobody applauds, and almost nobody survives. If you've ever felt like you're behind, if you've ever questioned your worth because progress was slow, if you've ever wondered whether the problem is you or the path you chose, don't click away. Because in the next few minutes, you're going to hear something most people never realize until it's too late. The reason your life keeps restarting isn't bad luck, or lack of talent, or missing opportunities. It's something far simpler, and far more uncomfortable. By the end of this video, you'll either understand why staying changes everything, or you'll go back to living the same cycle, waiting for the next wave of motivation to save you. This isn't a video you watch casually. It's a line you cross. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. Listen, when we talk about acceptance, most people misunderstand it at a fundamental level. They think acceptance is something you feel, something warm, something that shows up when conditions are right, when the person's easy, when the situation is stable, when the future looks predictable. That definition is comfortable and completely useless. Acceptance, the kind that actually changes lives, is not an emotion. It's a chef's decision. And decisions don't care how you feel in the moment. Feelings fluctuate. Decisions build trajectories. If you accept something only when it feels good, you haven't accepted anything at all. You've just tolerated it temporarily. And tolerance collapses the moment pressure appears. That's why so many people quit. Not because they lack talent, not because they lack intelligence, but because they tied commitment to mood. Mood is unreliable. Vision isn't. When I say, I accept you for my whole life, I'm not talking about liking every version of you. I'm talking about choosing continuity over convenience. I'm talking about refusing to renegotiate commitment every time reality deviates from expectations. That's a hard idea for modern minds because we live in an era of infinite options. Swipe culture, optimization culture. If something feels inefficient or uncomfortable, the instinct is to replace it. But that instinct, when applied to humans and to self-identity, creates fragility. Strong systems don't require perfect conditions. They require stability under stress. Acceptance is psychological gravity. It holds things together when everything else wants to fly apart. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid: you are not always impressive. You are not always productive. You are not always emotionally regulated. Some days you are irrational. Some days you're exhausted. Some days you don't recognize the person you were yesterday. If acceptance depended on consistency, no one would qualify. So lifetime acceptance begins when you stop demanding that reality perform for you in order to earn your loyalty. You decide first, you commit first, then you work. This applies inwardly before it applies outwardly. Most people abandon themselves long before anyone else does. The moment they fail, they withdraw self-respect. The moment progress slows, they question their worth. The moment they fall behind their own timeline, they mentally resign. That internal quitting is subtle, but it's devastating. Self-acceptance doesn't mean approving of every behavior. It means refusing to withdraw commitment to your own development. It means saying, I'm still here. We're still building. That stance alone rewires behavior. Because when quitting is no longer an option, the mind shifts from escape to problem solving. Energy moves from anxiety to iteration. This is how serious builders think. They don't ask, how do I feel about this today? They ask, what does this require over the long term? Long-term thinking eliminates emotional volatility. And yes, acceptance costs something. It costs the fantasy of control. It costs the illusion that you can engineer a life without friction. It costs the comfort of believing that if something hurts, it must be wrong. Pain is not a signal to leave. Sometimes it's a signal that growth is occurring faster than your identity can keep up. When you accept someone, or yourself, for a lifetime, you are accepting unfinished versions. You are accepting future failures you can't predict yet. You are accepting moments where the return on effort feels negative. That sounds irrational to short-term logic. But long-term logic understands compounding. Small acts of staying compound into trust. Trust compounds into resilience. Resilience compounds into outcomes that look impossible from the outside. This is why acceptance isn't soft, it's disciplined. It requires you to separate evaluation from abandonment. You can critique without quitting. You can improve without threatening to leave. You can confront reality without destabilizing the relationship or the self. Most people can't do this. That's why their lives reset so often. They keep starting over, thinking the next version will finally be easy. It won't. The only thing that changes is your tolerance for complexity. Lifetime acceptance is not romantic, it's structural. It's the framework that allows intelligence, effort, and ambition to operate without constantly fighting existential doubt. And once you make that decision, once you stop bargaining with commitment, you unlock something rare: psychological calm. Not because life becomes simple, but because your presence within it becomes stable. You stop asking, should I stay? You start asking, how do I build this better? That shift alone is power. So here's the closing thought I want you to sit with. The most advanced form of confidence is not believing you'll succeed. It's deciding you won't abandon the mission, regardless of how many versions of yourself it takes to get there. Decide once, commit fully, and let time do what emotion never could. Now let's talk about perfection, because this is where most ambition quietly dies. People say they want to grow, but what they really want is to arrive. They want the finished version without respecting the unfinished process. They want clarity without confusion, confidence without doubt, success without looking incompetent on the way there. And when reality doesn't cooperate, when the process looks messy and slow and awkward, they interpret that as failure. That interpretation is the problem. Growth does not come from perfection. And process, by definition, is inefficient, nonlinear, and uncomfortable. If it felt clean and obvious, everyone would do it. Perfection is static. Process is dynamic. A perfect system doesn't change. A living system evolves. Psychologically, perfection is attractive because it feels safe. If you wait until you're ready, if you wait until you're flawless, you never have to expose yourself to judgment. You never have to risk being wrong in public. You never have to confront the gap between who you think you are and what reality reflects back to you. But that safety is an illusion, and it comes at a cost. The cost is momentum. The mind learns through feedback, not fantasy. And feedback only comes from action. Imperfect action. Repeated action. Action that produces errors you didn't plan for. That's how intelligence actually works. Not by avoiding mistakes, but by rapidly identifying and correcting them. This is why real progress looks chaotic from the outside. Because iteration doesn't look like confidence. It looks like testing, adjusting, breaking things, and rebuilding with better information than you had before. If you're waiting to feel ready, you've misunderstood readiness. Readiness is not a prerequisite. It's a byproduct. And this applies to everything that matters: skill, relationships, identity, purpose. You don't discover the right version first. You build toward it by eliminating the wrong ones. Most people see mistakes as evidence that something is wrong with them. In reality, mistakes are evidence that something is working. They mean you're interacting with reality instead of rehearsing in your head. Philosophically, perfection belongs to abstractions. Reality belongs to approximations. Nothing meaningful emerges fully formed. Everything that lasts goes through ugly stages. Stages where the output doesn't match the intention. Where effort doesn't translate cleanly into results. Where progress is invisible unless you zoom out far enough. And this is where people quit. Not because the process isn't working, but because it doesn't match their internal narrative of how growth was supposed to feel. They expected clarity. They got confusion. They expected confidence. They got doubt. They expected acceleration. They got resistance. So they assume they're doing it wrong. They're not. They're doing it honestly. Growth feels disorienting because it forces you to operate beyond your current identity. You're literally asking the brain to function in territory it hasn't mapped yet. Of course it feels unstable. Of course it feels inefficient. That instability is the signal. The problem isn't that people fail. The problem is that they personalize failure instead of analyzing it. They turn a data point into a verdict. This didn't work, therefore I'm not capable. This was uncomfortable, therefore it must be wrong. This took longer than expected, therefore I should stop. That logic collapses long-term potential. Process-oriented thinking replaces judgment with curiosity. Instead of asking, why am I bad at this? You ask, what is this teaching me? Instead of trying to protect your ego, you optimize the system. And optimization requires tolerance for imperfection. You don't get stronger by lifting weights you can already handle. You get stronger by stressing the system just beyond its comfort zone, letting it fail in controlled ways, then adapting. The same principle applies psychologically. You don't build confidence by proving you're already capable. You build it by surviving moments where you clearly aren't, and realizing you didn't break. That realization changes everything. It shifts your relationship with failure. Failure stops being an identity threat and becomes a navigational tool. Something to learn from, not something to hide from. This is why people who focus on process outpace people who focus on outcomes. Outcomes are delayed. Process is immediate. You can always improve how you show up, how you think, how you respond, even when the results lag behind. And results always lag. That lag is where character is built. If you can stay engaged when the feedback is weak, when progress is subtle, when the rewards are delayed, you develop a kind of internal stability that no external validation can replace. You stop needing perfection to feel legitimate. You start valuing trajectory over status. And once you internalize that, something powerful happens. You become harder to stop. Because there is no single failure that can define you. There is no single moment that can disqualify you. You are no longer aiming to be flawless. You are aiming to be adaptive. That's a much higher standard. So if you're in the middle of something right now, and it feels unfinished, unclear, or unimpressive, understand this: that doesn't mean you're behind. It means you're in the process. And the process is where all real capability is forged. Here's the thought I want to leave you with: perfection never built anything real. But sustained process builds everything that lasts. Stay in the work long enough, and the results will eventually have no choice but to follow. Now we arrive at the point where everything either holds together or collapses. Because acceptance is meaningless without process, and process is useless without endurance. What separates people who build lasting outcomes from people who merely start impressive things is not intelligence, or talent, or even discipline. It's something far more basic and far more rare. They stay. That sounds simple, almost insulting in its simplicity. But staying is one of the hardest psychological acts a human can perform. Not staying when things are exciting. Not staying when progress is visible. Staying when nothing is happening. Staying when effort is high and feedback is low. Staying when the story you told yourself about how this would go turns out to be wrong. Most people don't quit because they fail. They quit because they get tired of ambiguity. The human brain craves resolution. It wants closure, certainty, signals that say, yes, this is working, or no, this is not. When those signals don't come, anxiety fills the gap, and anxiety pushes people toward exits. But the future does not reveal itself to impatient minds. Every meaningful long-term outcome exists behind a phase of sustained uncertainty. A phase where you are investing time, energy, and attention without any guarantee of return. That phase filters people out. Not because they aren't capable, but because they interpret uncertainty as a warning instead of a requirement. Staying means you accept that clarity is earned retroactively. You understand that when you're inside the process, things rarely make sense. It's only later, looking back, that the pattern becomes obvious. And this is where endurance becomes a form of intelligence. Emotionally reactive people respond to how things feel today. Enduring people respond to what they decided mattered in the long term. They don't re-evaluate the mission every time conditions change. They conserve energy by removing the question of whether to continue. That conservation is powerful. When staying is no longer negotiable, the mind stops scanning for escape routes and starts solving problems. Creativity increases. Stress becomes more manageable. Effort becomes more efficient because it's no longer split between building and doubting. Most people underestimate how much energy doubt consumes. They think exhaustion comes from work. In reality, exhaustion comes from internal conflict. From wanting progress but questioning commitment. From pushing forward while secretly preparing to retreat. Staying resolves that conflict. This doesn't mean blind persistence. It doesn't mean ignoring feedback or repeating the same mistake indefinitely. Staying does not mean stagnation. It means continuity. It means you adjust the strategy without abandoning the direction. That distinction is critical. People who quit often say they're being realistic. But realism without endurance is just fear wearing intellectual clothing. True realism understands that complex goals take longer than expected and require multiple versions of yourself to execute. You are not meant to get it right the first time. You are meant to remain long enough to get it right eventually. Philosophically, this is about time horizons. Short-time horizons reward speed, comfort, and appearance. Long-time horizons reward patience, depth, and substance. The longer your horizon, the less noise can distract you. That's why the future belongs to those who stay. Not because they're stubborn, but because they're aligned with how reality actually works. Anything that compounds trust, skill, insight, impact requires time. And time only works in your favor if you don't interrupt it. Every reset resets the compound. This is true in relationships, in careers, in self-mastery. Every time you leave prematurely, you pay a hidden cost. You lose the invisible gains that only show up after sustained presence. Those gains don't announce themselves, they accumulate quietly. And then one day, they look like overnight success to people who weren't there for the years of obscurity. Staying also requires humility. Because when you stay long enough, you will confront your limitations repeatedly. You will have to accept that you don't know what you're doing yet, that your current identity is insufficient for the future you're aiming at. That's uncomfortable. But leaving doesn't eliminate that discomfort. It just postpones it. You meet the same wall again, in a different form, in a different place, until you develop the capacity to move through it. Endurance accelerates maturity, and maturity changes your relationship with time. You stop rushing outcomes. You stop panicking during plateaus. You understand that silence doesn't mean stagnation. Sometimes it means consolidation. Sometimes it means the system is reorganizing itself at a deeper level. If you can stay through that, you gain something most people never experience: momentum that doesn't depend on motivation. Motivation is fragile. It spikes and crashes. Endurance is quiet and stable. It shows up even when motivation doesn't. This is why people who stay eventually look unstoppable. Not because they never struggled, but because they made struggling irrelevant to the decision to continue. They removed the emotional veto. So if you're listening to this and you're in a phase where progress feels slow, where doubt is loud, where quitting feels tempting, understand this is not the moment that disqualifies you. This is the moment that defines whether you belong to the future you're imagining. Here's the final thought I'll leave you with: talent starts things, motivation accelerates them, but only those who stay long enough ever finish something that truly matters.